You are bringing a personal dispute into my place of work and using your uniform to intimidate me.
Unacceptable? I'll show you what's unacceptable. You're done talking.
Officer, is this all because of the fence?
What? What?
The afternoon sun slanted through the tall, arched windows of room 204, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, forgotten constellations. It was a familiar, comforting light for David Miller. A tenured history professor at Northwood Community College for over 2 decades. At 54, he possessed the quiet authority that came not from a raised voice, but from a deep, unwavering passion for his subject. His lecture on the complexities of the Reconstruction era flowed with an easy cadence, a narrative woven from facts, anecdotes, and the profound human struggles that shaped a nation. His students, a mix of recent high school graduates and adults seeking new careers, were captivated. In this room, history wasn't a collection of dates. It was a living, breathing entity. And so, the failure of Reconstruction wasn't a single event, Miller explained, his hands gesturing to emphasize the point, but a slow erosion of political will, economic pressure, and the resurgence of a deeply entrenched ideology. It teaches us a critical lesson about progress. It is never guaranteed. It must be defended. It was at that precise moment that the heavy oak door at the back of the lecture hall swung open with a jarring thud that echoed off the high ceilings. The sound was a violation, a sharp crack in the sanctuary of learning Miller had so carefully cultivated. All 27 heads in the room turned. Standing in the doorway were 2 uniformed campus police officers. The lead officer, a man whose stocky build seemed squeezed into his navy blue uniform, stepped inside with an air of belligerent purpose. His name was Mark Thorne, a 38-year-old officer with 8 years on the campus force and a reputation among faculty for having a chip on his shoulder the size of a textbook. His file, locked away in the campus administration building, contained a thin but persistent collection of informal complaints from staff and students about his aggressive questioning and dismissive attitude, complaints that had always been smoothed over by his supervisor. He had the hardened look of a man who believed his badge gave him dominion over this small world of academics and young adults. Behind him, his partner, Chris Jenkins, lingered by the door. At 34, Jenkins was leaner, newer to the force, and wore an expression of perpetual unease. He had learned in his 2 years partnering with Thorne that it was easier to be a silent echo than a dissenting voice. He followed orders, kept his head down, and tried to ignore the churning in his gut when Thorne pushed things too far. Thorne's eyes, small and hard, scanned the room before locking onto Professor Miller at the podium. There was no professional neutrality in his gaze. There was a flicker of something else, something personal and sharp. He didn't address the class. He didn't nod to the professor. He simply started walking down the center aisle, his boots making heavy, rhythmic sounds on the worn linoleum floor, each step a deliberate intrusion. Jenkins followed a few paces behind, his hand resting uneasily on his duty belt, his eyes darting around at the students who were now whispering, their phones beginning to surface from pockets and backpacks. Miller stopped his lecture mid-sentence. He placed his hands on the podium, his posture remaining calm. Though a knot of confusion and concern tightened in his stomach, he didn't recognize the immediate threat, only the profound strangeness of the situation. Campus police rarely, if ever, entered a classroom during a lecture unless there was a medical emergency or a campus-wide threat. "Can I help you, officers?" Miller asked, his voice steady and respectful, projecting the same calm he used to manage classroom debates. Thorne didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of the podium, forcing Miller to look down at him. The difference in elevation did little to diminish the officer's intimidating presence. He was too close. A clear violation of personal space, a tactic designed to assert dominance. "David Miller?" Thorne asked, though it wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "I am Professor Miller." "Yes," he corrected gently. "Is there a problem?" Thorne's lips curled into a faint smirk. It was a look of satisfaction, of a power imbalance finally being corrected in his favor. He ignored the question entirely. He glanced over his shoulder at Jenkins, a silent command passing between them, before turning his cold gaze back to the professor. The students watched in stunned silence. The lecture on history forgotten, replaced by a tense, unfolding drama they didn't understand. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. The quiet hum of the projector was the only sound, a stark contrast to the hammering pulse many of the students could feel in their own chests. Thorne leaned forward slightly, his voice low but carrying a distinct edge of menace that cut through the silence of the lecture hall. "We have a problem," he said. His eyes narrowed. "A big one, and it involves you." Professor Miller maintained his composure, his hands still resting on the podium. He had spent a lifetime studying conflict, from the Peloponnesian War to the Cold War, and he understood the importance of de-escalation. "All right," he said, his tone even. "If there's a problem, perhaps we can discuss it in the hallway. I'm in the middle of a class." He gestured subtly toward his students, who were now openly staring, their initial confusion hardening into a mix of fear and indignation. The glow of phone screens became more prominent in the dimly lit hall as several students began to discreetly record the encounter. Officer Thorne seemed to relish the audience. The presence of the students didn't deter him. It fueled him. "No," he said flatly. "We're not going to discuss it in the hallway. We're going to handle this right here, right now." He took another step closer, his chest nearly touching the wooden podium. A clear act of physical intimidation. "You think these walls make you untouchable? They don't?" A confused murmur rippled through the students. This was clearly not standard police procedure. There was an animosity in the officer's voice that felt raw and personal. "Officer," Miller said, his voice firming slightly, a teacher addressing a disruptive student. "You're interrupting a scheduled class and causing a disturbance. You haven't stated your purpose or identified any official cause for this intrusion. I'm asking you again. What is this about?" Thorne's jaw tightened. He hated that tone, the calm intellectual authority that Miller projected without effort. It was the same tone Thorne imagined Miller used in every aspect of his life, a tone that, in Thorne's mind, dripped with condescension. It was the reason he was here. "This is about a private citizen complaint," Thorne snapped, his voice rising. "A serious one?" "A complaint from whom? Regarding what?" Miller pressed, his patience beginning to fray. "If it's a private matter, it has no place here in my classroom during my professional duties." "Don't you tell me my place?" Thorne's voice was now a low growl. "You don't get to decide what's relevant. I do." He pointed a thick finger at Miller's chest. "We got a report about threatening behavior, harassment." The words hung in the air, absurd and out of place. David Miller was a man known for his gentle demeanor and his open-door policy for students struggling with their coursework. The idea of him harassing or threatening anyone was laughable to those who knew him. The students exchanged incredulous looks. "Threatening behavior?" Miller repeated, a genuine look of bewilderment on his face. "That's a serious accusation." "Officer, I have no idea what you're referring to. I think there has been a significant mistake." "Oh, there's no mistake," Thorne sneered. He glanced back at Jenkins, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent plea to de-escalate, to take it outside. Thorne ignored him completely. His focus was lasered in on the professor. "You think you can just do what you want, and there are no consequences?" The vague nature of the accusation, The refusal to discuss it privately, the undisguised personal venom, it all began to click into place for Miller. This wasn't about a legitimate complaint. This was a targeted harassment. His mind raced, searching for a connection, any interaction that could have been so grotesquely twisted, and then it landed. A dispute. A petty, ridiculous neighborhood dispute. "Officer Thorne," Miller said, his voice now cold with realization. "Is this about the fence?" The mention of the fence seemed to detonate something within Thorne. His face flushed a deep, angry red. The pretense of official police business evaporated, replaced by raw, personal fury. He had wanted to keep it vague, to humiliate Miller under the guise of an anonymous, serious complaint. But Miller had called it out, naming the petty grievance in front of 24 witnesses. "You don't get to say my name," Thorne spat, his hand instinctively going to the handcuffs on his belt. "And you sure as hell don't get to play dumb. You know exactly what you did." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that was still audible to the students in the front row. "You were warned. I told you what would happen." His partner, Jenkins, took a hesitant step forward. "Mark, maybe we should—" "Stay out of this. Chris." Thorne cut him off without looking back. Miller stood his ground, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning anger. "You are abusing your authority, officer. You are bringing a personal dispute into my place of work and using your uniform to intimidate me in front of my students. This is completely unacceptable." "Unacceptable?" Thorne laughed. A short, ugly sound. "I'll show you what's unacceptable. You're done talking? You're done teaching for the day?" He gestured with his head to Jenkins. "Cuff him." A collective gasp went through the classroom. The word "cuff him" shattered the last remnants of normalcy. This was no longer a bizarre interruption. It was an assault on everything the students understood about authority and order. Chris Jenkins froze for a second, his eyes wide with a flicker of panic. He looked from his partner's enraged face to the professor's stoic, disbelieving one, and then to the sea of students. Their phones now held up openly, a constellation of small, rectangular eyes recording his every move. His training screamed at him that this was wrong. There was no probable cause, no imminent threat, no basis for an arrest in this classroom, but his fear of Thorne, a fear cultivated over 2 years of partnership, was more immediate. "Mark, come on," Jenkins pleaded in a low voice. "We can't do this here." "I gave you an order." "Officer," Thorne snarled, his voice laced with a threat that Jenkins knew all too well. "Do your job." With visible reluctance, Jenkins unclipped his handcuffs and moved toward the side of the podium. Professor Miller watched him approach, not with fear, but with a profound and heavy sense of disappointment. He made a conscious decision. He would not resist. He would not argue further. He knew that any form of resistance, no matter how justified, would be twisted and used against him. He would let this grotesque theater play out, and he would put his faith in the system he had taught his students to critically examine for his entire career. "Officers, I want it on record that I am not resisting," Miller stated, his voice clear and unwavering for the benefit of the dozens of recording devices. "I am complying, but I am doing so under protest. This is an unlawful arrest." He slowly turned and placed his hands behind his back. Palms open. Jenkins hesitated, the metal of the cuffs cold in his hand. Thorne, however, had no such reservations. He shoved past the podium, knocking a stack of papers to the floor, and grabbed Miller's wrist himself. He wrenched the professor's arm up at an unnatural angle, causing Miller to wince in pain. "I said, don't play games with me," Thorne grunted, his face close to Miller's ear. He snapped the first cuff onto Miller's right wrist with a sharp, metallic click that seemed to silence the entire campus. He then grabbed Miller's other arm and cinched the second cuff on, pulling them painfully tight. The metal bit into Miller's skin. A student in the front row, a young woman named Sarah, let out a small cry. Another student, a military veteran in his late 20s, stood up abruptly. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" the veteran demanded, his voice ringing with indignation. "He wasn't doing anything. You can't just come in here and do this." Thorne shot him a venomous look over his shoulder. "Sit down and shut your mouth before you're next," he threatened. "This is official police business." The veteran remained standing, his fists clenched, but he didn't move closer. He knew the cost of escalating with a cop on a power trip, but his phone, like everyone else's, was still recording. Thorne shoved Miller forward, away from the podium. "Let's go. Walk." As Miller was paraded down the center aisle of his own classroom, flanked by the two officers, the sense of violation was palpable. This was the space where he had dedicated his life to fostering critical thought, to exploring the nuances of justice and power through the lens of history. Now, that same space was the stage for a brutish display of force, a living lesson in the very abuses of power he lectured about. His students watched, their faces a mixture of horror, anger, and helplessness. They were seeing their mentor, a figure of respect and intellect, being humiliated for a reason they couldn't fathom. The walk from the podium to the door felt like a mile. The silence was broken only by Thorne's heavy breathing and the faint rustle of clothing. As they reached the doorway, Miller turned his head slightly to look back at his students. His expression wasn't one of defeat. It was calm, resolute. It was a silent message to them. Watch this. Remember this. This is history, too. The heavy oak door closed behind them, shutting out the sight but not the shockwave that followed. For a moment, the students sat in stunned silence. Then, the room erupted. Some rushed to the windows to see where the officers were taking him. Others started frantically texting and calling, uploading their videos with furious captions. The veteran who had spoken up walked to the front of the room and picked up the papers Thorne had knocked over. He placed them carefully back on the podium. An act of small, defiant respect. The sanctuary had been breached, and the lesson of the day had been irrevocably changed from the reconstruction of the past to the deconstruction of justice happening in their present. Once in the hallway, the acoustics changed. The muted shock of the classroom was replaced by the mundane echo of a college corridor during class hours. Quiet, with the distant hum of ventilation and the faint sound of another professor's voice from a room down the hall. Thorne maintained his tight grip on Miller's upper arm, propelling him forward with unnecessary force. Jenkins walked slightly behind, his face a mask of conflict, his eyes scanning the empty hall as if hoping for an interruption, a reason to stop this runaway train. He got his wish. As they rounded the corner toward the main administrative wing, a figure blocked their path. It was Susan Albright, the Dean of Humanities, a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that had been honed over 40 years in academia. She had been on her way back from a meeting when she saw the commotion through the small window of Miller's classroom door. The uniforms, the handcuffs, the shocked faces of the students. She stood dead center in the hallway, her arms crossed. Her presence was not physically imposing, but her authority on this campus was absolute. "Officer Thorne," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Stop. Right there." Thorne was forced to a halt. His grip on Miller's arm tightened instinctively. "Ma'am, this is official police business. You need to step aside." Dean Albright's eyes didn't waver. They moved from Thorne's flushed face to the handcuffs on Professor Miller's wrists, then to Jenkins's averted gaze. She knew both officers. and she had a particularly keen memory of the 2 previous occasions she'd had to speak with Thorne about his overly aggressive handling of minor student conduct issues. "I will not step aside," she stated, her voice dropping a register. "You will release Professor Miller's arm. You will tell me exactly what is happening and under whose authority you have arrested a member of my faculty during a lecture, and you will do it now." "I don't answer to you," Thorne retorted, trying to puff up his chest. "I answer to the chief. We're taking him in for questioning regarding a credible threat." "A credible threat?" Dean Albright took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "David Miller is a threat to whom, exactly? He has been a distinguished professor at this college for 24 years. The only threat I see here, officer, is the one you and your partner are posing to the academic integrity and physical safety of this institution." She looked past him at Jenkins. "Officer Jenkins, do you have anything to add to this? Do you believe Professor Miller poses a risk that justifies this public spectacle?" Jenkins flinched as if he'd been struck. He avoided her gaze, staring at a point on the wall just over her shoulder. "Ma'am, we're just following procedure," he mumbled, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "This is not procedure." Albright cut him off, her voice sharp as glass. "I've been here longer than your chief has been on the force. I know what procedure looks like. It does not look like 2 officers storming a classroom to settle what I can only assume is a personal score." Her gaze snapped back to Thorne. "This stops here. You will uncuff Professor Miller this instant, and we will all go to the campus security office to sort this out in a civilized manner." Thorne let out a humorless laugh. "I'm not uncuffing anyone. He's under arrest. Now get out of my way, or I'll add interfering with an investigation to the list." It was a bluff, and they both knew it. But Dean Albright didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled her cell phone from her pocket. "Fine," she said, her thumb already moving across the screen. "You leave me no choice." Her first call was not to the campus police chief. She bypassed him entirely. Her finger pressed the contact for Dr. Evelyn Reed, the president of the Northwood Community College District. "Evelyn," she said into the phone, her eyes still locked on Thorne. "It's Susan Albright. I am standing in the main humanities hallway. I am looking at 2 of our campus officers, Thorne and Jenkins, who have a handcuffed Professor David Miller in their custody. They have just removed him from his classroom in front of his students and are refusing to give me a legitimate reason for the arrest. Thorne is acting with extreme prejudice. I believe he is abusing his authority in a flagrant and dangerous manner. I need you to intervene at the district level immediately." The color drained from Jenkins's face. Thorne's jaw clenched so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He had expected to deal with the campus chief, a man he knew how to manage, a man who disliked paperwork and confrontation. He had not expected the Dean of Humanities to escalate this to the highest office in the district in under 30 seconds. The game had just changed, and the power dynamic in the hallway had irrevocably shifted. The quiet authority of a 68-year-old academic had just proven far more potent than his badge and gun. "Doctor." Evelyn Reed's voice came through Dean Albright's phone, crisp and laced with immediate concern. "Stay right where you are. Susan, do not let them take him off campus. I am calling Chief Harrison directly and then our general counsel. Get them to the security office. I'll have someone from my office there in 10 minutes. Albright ended the call and looked at Thorne, her expression unyielding. "You heard her. The district president is now involved. Your little power play is over. We are going to the security office. Now." The command in her voice left no room for argument. Thorne, for the first time, looked uncertain. The specter of the district's legal team, a force far more formidable than a tenured professor, had entered the equation. He shot a venomous glare at Miller, as if this escalation was somehow his fault. Wordlessly, he turned and began marching Miller toward the campus security office, his grip still unnecessarily tight. Dean Albright followed closely behind, a silent guardian ensuring they didn't deviate. The campus security office was a small, sterile space with gray walls and fluorescent lighting that hummed with an irritating buzz. Thorne shoved Miller into a chair in a small interrogation room, a windowless box with a metal table and a few chairs. "Stay here," Thorne ordered, before stepping outside and closing the door, leaving Miller alone with his thoughts. Outside, in the main office, Dean Albright confronted the two officers again. "I want your incident report number," she demanded. "We haven't filed one yet," Thorne grumbled, slumping into a chair behind a desk. "Then you can start now," Albright said. "I want a full account of the credible threat that necessitated this circus." Thorne began to type on a nearby computer with slow, deliberate keystrokes. Jenkins stood awkwardly by the door, trying to make himself as small as possible. The office phone rang. It was the campus police chief, Frank Harrison, his voice a panicked bark that was audible even from a few feet away. "Thorne, what in God's name is going on? I just got off the phone with President Reed. She's talking about lawsuits and flagrant abuses of power. You were supposed to be handling a noise complaint." Thorne's face hardened. "It escalated, Chief. Miller became belligerent, non-compliant." It was a bald-faced lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Dean Albright stepped forward. "Chief Harrison, this is Susan Albright. Your officer is misrepresenting the facts. I was there. Professor Miller was the model of compliance. He was, however, arrested in front of 24 students who have the entire event on video. Officer Thorne is the one who escalated this situation from the moment he walked into the classroom." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "The president's legal counsel is on his way to your office," Harrison finally said, his voice strained. "Do not let Professor Miller leave. Do not question him further. Do not file that report until you speak with him. And Thorne, you are in a world of trouble." The line went dead. Thorne slammed the phone down. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I'm the one upholding the law here." Just then, the door to the security office opened. A man in a sharp, tailored suit stepped inside. He was William Sterling, the lead attorney for the Northwood College District. He was in his 50s, with a calm, analytical demeanor that radiated competence. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene. Thorne's defiant posture, Jenkins's terrified one, and Dean Albright's righteous fury. "Where is Professor Miller?" Sterling asked, his voice quiet but commanding. Albright gestured to the interrogation room. "In there. He's been held for about 15 minutes. Sterling nodded. He walked over to Thorne. "Officer Thorne, I am advising you and Officer Jenkins that you are now the subjects of an active internal investigation by the district. You will surrender your body cameras for immediate review. You will provide your badges and service weapons to Chief Harrison, and you will refrain from speaking to anyone further about this incident until you are formally interviewed with union representation. Is that understood?" Thorne's jaw dropped. "You can't do that. This is a police matter." "This is a district employment matter now," Sterling corrected him smoothly. "You are district employees who have created a potentially catastrophic liability for this institution. Your police powers on this campus are granted by the district, and they can be suspended by the district." He turned to Albright. "Susan, would you please inform Professor Miller he is free to go? My office will be in touch with him to offer our sincerest apologies and any support he needs." The narrative Thorne had tried to build, one of a defiant suspect and a justified arrest, had completely crumbled. Stripped of his authority and facing the cold, calculating machinery of the district's legal department, he was no longer a cop in control. He was just an employee who had made a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. As Dean Albright opened the door to let Professor Miller out, Thorne saw the look on the professor's face, not of triumph, but of weary resolve. And in that moment, Thorne knew he hadn't won. He had just started a war. He had absolutely no chance of winning. Doctor. Evelyn Reed sat in her spacious office on the top floor of the district's administration building, the city skyline visible through her floor-to-ceiling windows. The view, usually a source of calm reflection, offered no comfort now. In her hand, she held her phone, the conversation with a very shaken Chief Harrison having just ended. On her desk, an email from William Sterling confirmed the initial details: an unsanctioned arrest, a personal vendetta, and a classroom full of digital witnesses. The potential fallout was staggering. At 62, Evelyn Reed had navigated the complex politics of public education for her entire career. She had dealt with budget crises, union disputes, and curriculum battles, but this was different. This was a self-inflicted wound, an act of such profound stupidity and malice that it threatened to undermine the very foundation of trust between the institution and the community it served. It was a legal, financial, and public relations nightmare rolled into one. Her first call after speaking to the chief had been to the chair of the Board of Trustees, informing him that a serious personnel incident involving campus police was unfolding. Her next action was to summon her crisis management team. Within the hour, the district's boardroom was occupied by the key players. William Sterling, the general counsel, sat at one end of the long mahogany table, his laptop open. Beside him were the head of human resources, the director of communications, and a visibly pale Chief Harrison, who had been called over from the campus. Dr. Reed stood at the head of the table, her expression grim. "Let's get straight to it," Reed began, her voice devoid of pleasantries. "Will, give us the unvarnished facts as we know them." Sterling cleared his throat. At approximately 2:15 p.m., campus police officers Mark Thorne and Chris Jenkins entered Professor David Miller's history class. They interrupted the lecture and, after a brief verbal exchange, Officer Thorne arrested Professor Miller, placing him in handcuffs in full view of his students. Dean Susan Albright intervened in the hallway and, to her great credit, prevented them from removing him from campus. I arrived shortly thereafter and suspended both officers' activities pending a full investigation. The communications director, a sharp woman named Maria Flores, spoke up immediately. "Are there videos? We have to assume there are videos?" "We have to assume there are at least 24 videos," Sterling confirmed. "And we should assume they will be online before the 6 o'clock news." A collective groan went through the room. "What was the predicate for the arrest?" "Doctor," Reed asked, her eyes fixed on Chief Harrison. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his high-backed leather chair. "This is the part that is indefensible. It appears the initial complaint was filed by Officer Thorne himself, acting as a private citizen. He and Professor Miller are neighbors. They've been having a dispute over a property line fence for several weeks." Silence descended on the boardroom. The sheer audacity and unprofessionalism of the act were breathtaking. "So let me be perfectly clear, Doctor," Reed said, her voice dangerously quiet. "One of our police officers used his badge, his uniform, and his authority, granted by this district, to intimidate and arrest a faculty member in his classroom to settle a grudge over a backyard fence?" "That appears to be the case. Yes," Harrison conceded. his face ashen. William Sterling interjected. The legal exposure here is massive. We're looking at clear violations of the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments. A federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983 is not a possibility. It's a certainty. We're talking false arrest, malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And given the setting, a classroom, the punitive damages could be astronomical. What about the officers' records? The HR director asked. Chief Harrison cleared his throat. Officer Jenkins has a clean record. Thorne has had several informal complaints regarding his temper and his confrontational style. Nothing ever rose to the level of a formal disciplinary action. And why not? Doctor. Reed's question was sharp. Were these complaints investigated, or were they swept under the rug? The chief had no good answer, and the silence that followed was damning. The district had not just employed a rogue officer, it had tolerated one. The systemic failure was as much a liability as Thorne's actions. Maria Flores, the communications director, began mapping out a strategy. We need to get ahead of this. We can't wait for the videos to hit the news. We need to issue a statement immediately. We announce that the officers have been placed on administrative leave. We state that we have opened a full and transparent investigation. We apologize to Professor Miller and his students. We have to show that the district is taking this with the utmost seriousness and that the actions of these two officers do not reflect the values of our institution. Agreed, said Dr. Reed. Will, I want you to personally reach out to Professor Miller. Extend our support and let him know we will cooperate fully. Chief, I want you to pull every piece of paper associated with Thorne, every complaint, every performance review, every use of force report. We need to know the full scope of our vulnerability. The mood in the room was one of grim triage. The damage was done. The district, once a respected pillar of the community, was now on the brink of a scandal that would call into question the judgment of its leaders and the integrity of its police force. As the meeting concluded and the team broke off to execute their assigned tasks, Dr. Reed walked back to her office window. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city. The district had just awakened to a crisis, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that the night was going to be a long one, and the dawn would bring a reckoning. David Miller sat at the dining room table in his quiet, book-lined home, a cup of untouched tea growing cold beside him. It had been 3 hours since he'd walked out of the campus security office, a free man in title but a prisoner of the afternoon's surreal events. Dean Albright had insisted on driving him home, her protective presence a small comfort in the jarring aftermath. Now, in the silence of his own house, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a tremor in his hands he couldn't seem to control. His wife, Clara, a landscape architect with a calm and steady nature, sat across from him, her face etched with a mixture of fury and concern. She had been repotting orchids in the greenhouse when he called, his voice strained, to tell her what had happened. She had listened in horrified silence, and now her anger was a palpable force in the room. The doorbell rang, startling them both. It was William Sterling, the district's general counsel, looking exactly as he had in the security office, impeccably dressed and professionally somber. Professor Miller. Clara, he said with a respectful nod as David let him in. I hope I'm not intruding. I felt it was important to speak with you in person, away from the campus. Come in, mister. Sterling, David said, leading him to the living room. Sterling didn't sit immediately. He stood and faced the couple, his expression direct. First, on behalf of the Northwood College District and President Reed, I want to offer you our most profound and sincere apology. What happened to you today was an indefensible abuse of power. It was a violation of your rights, your dignity, and the sanctity of your classroom. There is no excuse for it. The apology was direct and unequivocal. David nodded slowly, appreciating the gesture. Thank you. Mr. Sterling, I accept your apology on behalf of the district. The actions of your officers, however, are another matter. I understand completely, Sterling replied. Which brings me to my second reason for being here. We have launched a comprehensive internal investigation. To that end, and only if you feel up to it, I would be grateful if you could walk me through the events that led up to this. Specifically, the personal dispute that Officer Thorne seems to have used as a pretext. David took a deep breath and finally sat down. Clara placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. He began to speak, his voice low and measured, the historian in him taking over, laying out the narrative piece by piece. Mark Thorne and his wife moved in next door about a year ago, David began. We were cordial at first. The usual waves over the fence, polite small talk when getting the mail. The trouble started about 2 months ago. We have a very old, very large oak tree in our backyard. Its roots, over many decades, have caused the original property line fence, a simple chain-link fence that was there when we bought the house 30 years ago, to buckle and lean in a few spots. He paused, gathering his thoughts. My wife, Clara, is a landscape architect. We decided it was time to replace the fence with something nicer, a proper wooden privacy fence. We hired a surveyor to confirm the property line, as is standard practice. The survey revealed that the old fence was actually installed about 2 feet inside our property line. Meaning, for years, our neighbors have been enjoying 2 feet of our yard. Clara took over. We weren't concerned about the past. We simply wanted to put the new fence on the correct, legally surveyed line. We provided the Thornes with a copy of the survey, a letter from the surveyor, and a very polite note explaining our plans. We even offered to split the cost of the section of fence between our properties, even though we weren't legally obligated to. Thorne's reaction was explosive. David continued. He came to our door that evening, off duty but radiating aggression. He accused us of trying to steal his land. He claimed the old fence line was the real property line, a concept known as adverse possession. Though the legal standard for that is incredibly high and didn't apply here, I tried to explain the survey calmly, but he wouldn't listen. He got loud. He said, I'm a cop. I know the law better than you. Professor. He ended the conversation by pointing his finger in my face and saying, You put up that fence, and you'll regret it. There are ways to handle people like you. Sterling listened intently, making notes in a small leather-bound book. We saw it as an empty threat from an angry neighbor, David said, a note of regret in his voice. We hired a lawyer to send him a formal letter, reiterating our legal right to build the fence on our property. We had the new fence installed last week, on the correct line. It was done professionally, without incident. I thought that was the end of it. I never imagined he would bring that rage into my classroom and use his badge as a weapon. The story was complete. It was a tale of suburban pettiness transformed into a terrifying abuse of state power. The motive was clear, the premeditation obvious. Thorne hadn't just snapped. He had plotted, waiting for an opportunity to humiliate the man next door. The professor, he felt, had disrespected him. William Sterling closed his notebook. Professor Miller, thank you for sharing that. This account is crucial. It establishes a clear pattern of malice. It moves this from a case of poor judgment to a deliberate, targeted act of retaliation. He stood up. The district will do everything in its power to rectify this. But I must be honest with you. What you have just described is grounds for a major federal lawsuit. The district will defend itself institutionally, but we will not defend the actions of these officers. You have rights that extend far beyond an internal investigation, and I would strongly encourage you to seek your own legal counsel to explore them. It was a stark admission and a piece of sound advice. As Sterling left, David and Clara looked at each other. The path forward was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about a personal wrong anymore. It was about ensuring that the power vested in a uniform could never again be used to settle a score over a backyard fence. While David Miller was giving his testimony in the quiet of his living room, a digital storm was brewing. In dorm rooms, student apartments, and coffee shops across the city, the unblinking eyes of smartphones were sharing their truth. The first video, uploaded by Sarah from the front row, hit a popular social media platform with a simple, furious caption, "Campus cop just arrested my history professor in the middle of class for no reason. This is insane. Hashtag Northwood College. Hashtag abuse of power." The video was shaky but brutally clear. It captured Thorne's initial belligerent approach, his sneering dismissal of Miller's questions, the professor's calm compliance, and the sickening, audible click of the handcuffs. It captured the veteran student's outburst and Thorne's snarled threat in response. It was raw, immediate, and utterly damning. Within 30 minutes, it had 1,000 views. An hour in, it had been shared so many times the platform's algorithm flagged it as trending. Local news outlets, constantly monitoring social media for breaking stories, picked it up. A reporter from the city's largest news station sent Sarah a direct message, asking for permission to use her footage. Then, a second video appeared. This one filmed from a wider angle near the back of the room. It provided context, showing more of the students' shocked reactions and the overall atmosphere of disbelief. A third video, filmed by the veteran, was perhaps the most compelling. His hand was steady, his military training evident even in this small act. His footage captured the subtle, pleading look on Officer Jenkins's face and the precise moment Thorne shoved the papers from the podium, a petty act of aggression that spoke volumes. By 7 p.m. and P. The story was the lead item on the local news website, complete with embedded videos. Controversy at Northwood. Professor arrested in classroom. Students allege police misconduct. The district's preemptive statement, released by Maria Flores an hour earlier, was included, but it was buried beneath the visceral power of the footage. The professional, carefully worded apology couldn't compete with the raw image of a respected educator being hauled away in handcuffs. The comment sections exploded. Alumni expressed their shock and disgust. Current students shared their own negative experiences with Officer Thorne. Parents demanded answers. Civil rights activists began sharing the videos, framing it as a textbook example of the abuse of power that can fester in closed systems like a campus police force. For Dr. Evelyn Reed and her crisis team, watching the story unfold online was like watching a slow-motion car crash. They were doing everything right by the book, suspending the officers, investigating transparently, apologizing publicly, but the narrative was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to the students and their phones. The videos did more than just tell the story. They became the primary evidence. William Sterling and his team downloaded every available clip, cataloging them by angle and timestamp. They could see, without a shadow of a doubt, that Miller's account was accurate. He never raised his voice. He never made a threatening move. He complied. Thorne's inevitable claim of a belligerent suspect was dead on arrival, disproven by a dozen different digital angles. The footage was particularly damning for Officer Jenkins. While Thorne was the clear aggressor, the video showed Jenkins's passivity. He stood by. He watched his partner escalate the situation. He followed an unlawful order. His failure to intervene, to uphold his duty to de-escalate, was captured for the world to see. He was not just a bystander, he was an enabler, inside the campus police department. Chief Harrison watched the news report on his office computer, his head in his hands. He had just reviewed the body camera footage from both officers. It was even worse than the student videos. The audio was crystal clear. It captured Thorne's whispered threat to Miller. "You were warned. I told you what would happen." It was an unambiguous admission of retaliatory intent. It was the nail in his own coffin, recorded by a device mandated by district policy. The unblinking eyes of a generation had not just witnessed an event, they had documented a crime. They had provided an unimpeachable record that would form the backbone of the investigation and the lawsuit to come. The videos stripped away all ambiguity, leaving only the cold, hard truth of what had happened in room 204. For Officer Mark Thorne, who had wanted to make a public example of David Miller, his wish had been granted in the most ironic way imaginable. He had become the example, an example of what happens when a man with a badge forgets that in the modern world, everyone is watching. 2 days later, Officer Mark Thorne sat in a windowless room, not unlike the one he had forced Professor Miller into. This one, however, was in the district's administrative building and was far more intimidating. The air was cold, and the only furniture was a heavy table and 3 chairs. Across from him sat 2 investigators from the newly hired external firm tasked with ensuring the internal affairs investigation was impartial. One was a former prosecutor, a woman with piercing eyes named Elena Ramirez. The other was a retired state police captain, a man whose stoic silence was more unnerving than any question. Thorne's union representative sat beside him, a portly man who looked weary before the interview had even begun. Thorne had come in with a swagger, an attempt to project the same dominance he relied on in the field. He believed he could control the narrative. He would paint Miller as an arrogant academic who had goaded him, who had been subtly non-compliant, forcing his hand. Ramirez began, her voice neutral. "Officer Thorne, please walk us through the events of Tuesday afternoon, starting with your decision to enter Professor Miller's classroom." Thorne launched into his prepared story. "We received a citizen complaint about threatening behavior from Mr. Miller. My partner and I went to make contact with him. We entered the classroom to locate him. He immediately became confrontational and argumentative." "Confrontational in what way?" Ramirez asked, her gaze unwavering. "His tone," Thorne said. "He questioned our authority. He refused my initial request to step into the hallway. In my experience, that kind of verbal resistance is a precursor to physical resistance. I made a judgment call to secure him for officer safety and to continue the investigation." The retired captain leaned forward slightly. "We've seen the videos. Officer Thorne, all of them. The student videos and your own body camera. We don't see any verbal resistance. We see you refuse his request to step into the hallway. We see a man asking clarifying questions. Can you point to a specific moment on those videos where the professor threatened you?" Thorne's confidence wavered for the first time. "It's not always about what you see. It's about the feeling, the atmosphere, his posture. He was challenging me. He was standing at his podium, teaching a class," Ramirez countered. "Your body camera audio also captured you saying, 'You were warned. I told you what would happen.' What did you mean by that?" Thorne's face hardened. "I was referring to the consequences of his threatening behavior." "Or were you referring to the conversation you had at his front door regarding the installation of a new fence between your properties?" Ramirez asked, her voice sharp. The union rep shifted in his seat, placing a hand on Thorne's arm. But the damage was done. The direct question, showing they knew everything, had punctured Thorne's defensive wall. He fell silent, his jaw working. "We also have your initial complaint report," Ramirez continued, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "You filed it yourself, as a private citizen, an hour before you went to the campus. You then assigned the call to yourself. Is that standard procedure, to investigate your own personal complaints?" "It was a serious threat," Thorne mumbled, his eyes fixed on the report. "The threat, you reported, was that Professor Miller's lawyer sent you a letter informing you of his legal right to build a fence," Ramirez stated flatly. "That is not a threat. That is a civil legal matter. You used that as a pretext, didn't you, officer? You used the color of law to settle a personal score." Thorne's swagger had completely evaporated. He was cornered, his lies exposed by a mountain of digital evidence. He slumped in his chair, a sullen, defeated man. An hour later, it was Officer Chris Jenkins's turn. He entered the room looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. He was alone. He had waived his right to have a union rep present, a sign he was ready to break ranks. His demeanor was the polar opposite of Thorne's. He was remorseful, scared, and cooperative. "I knew it was wrong from the start," Jenkins said, his voice barely a whisper. "When Mark told me what we were doing, I told him we shouldn't. It was a personal thing." "Then why did you go through with it, Officer Jenkins?" the captain asked, his tone softer, more encouraging than it had been with Thorne. "I was afraid of him," Jenkins admitted, shamefaced. "Mark, he can be a bully. If you're not with him, you're against him. He'd make my life hell on the job. I thought we'd just go, talk to the professor, embarrass him a little, and leave. I never thought he'd actually arrest him. When he told me to cuff him, I froze." "You did more than freeze, officer," Ramirez said gently but firmly. "You followed the order. You assisted in an unlawful arrest. The videos show you had multiple opportunities to intervene, to suggest a different course of action, to call the chief. Why didn't you?" Tears welled up in Jenkins's eyes. "I don't know. I messed up. I know I did. I should have done something. I should have refused. But I just followed along. I've been following along for 2 years. And this is where it got me." His confession was a complete capitulation. He corroborated every detail of Miller's story and Dean Albright's intervention. He admitted Thorne's motive was purely retaliatory. He painted a picture of a partnership built not on trust, but on fear and intimidation. When Jenkins left the room, Ramirez and the captain looked at each other. The case was sealed. They had Thorne's arrogant lies, directly contradicted by video evidence and his own body camera. And now, they had a full confession from his partner. The path to termination was clear. But more than that, Jenkins's testimony revealed a deeper rot within the campus police force, a culture of fear that allowed a bully with a badge to operate with impunity, until the day he finally went too far, in a room full of cameras and a man who refused to be broken. A week after the arrest, David Miller walked into the downtown offices of a law firm renowned for taking on David and Goliath civil rights cases. He was accompanied by his wife, Clara, and a folder thick with documents: the surveyor's report, the lawyer's letter regarding the fence, and links to a dozen news articles about his ordeal. He felt a sense of resolve he hadn't felt since the incident. This was no longer just about his own vindication. It was about ensuring no other educator or student in the Northwood district would ever have to endure such a violation. He was there to meet Eleanor Vance, a formidable attorney in her early 60s with a fiery reputation and a track record of winning landmark settlements against powerful institutions. Her office was decorated not with diplomas, but with framed newspaper clippings detailing her victories against corrupt police departments and negligent corporations. Vance listened to David's story without interruption, her expression intent. She occasionally made a note on a yellow legal pad, but mostly she just listened, absorbing the details, the emotions, and the profound sense of injustice. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Professor Miller," she said, her voice a powerful instrument of controlled indignation, "what you experienced was not just a mistake or a case of poor judgment. It was a calculated act of state-sponsored intimidation. Officer Thorne used a publicly funded uniform, a badge, and a weapon to execute a personal vendetta. His partner enabled him. The department, through its negligence in supervising him, allowed him, and the district is ultimately responsible for the actions of its employees." She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "A simple termination of the officers is not sufficient. Apologies are not sufficient. To truly achieve justice and force systemic change, we must hit the institution where it is most vulnerable, its budget and its reputation. We need to make the cost of this kind of behavior so prohibitively high that the district has no choice but to completely overhaul its campus police force." The course of action was clear. Eleanor Vance and her team spent the next 2 weeks meticulously preparing their case. They deposed the students who had taken the videos. They subpoenaed every record related to Officers Thorne and Jenkins, uncovering the previously buried complaints against Thorne. They hired a police practices expert who wrote a scathing report on the department's lack of training, supervision, and accountability. Then they filed the lawsuit. It was submitted to the United States District Court, a clear signal that this was being treated as a federal civil rights matter of the highest order. The defendants were not just Mark Thorne and Chris Jenkins, but also Police Chief Frank Harrison for negligent supervision and the Northwood Community College District itself for creating and maintaining a culture that allowed such abuses to occur. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal argumentation, but it was the number at the end that made headlines: $9.8 million. The figure was broken down into several categories: compensatory damages for the emotional distress, humiliation, and damage to Professor Miller's professional reputation, punitive damages against the officers personally, designed to punish their malicious conduct, and a significant portion aimed at the district for its systemic failures. The filing of the lawsuit was a major media event. Eleanor Vance held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse, with David and Clara standing silently behind her. "Today, we have asked a federal court to hold the Northwood College District and its police force accountable," Vance announced to a crowd of reporters and television cameras. "This is not about offense. This is about the fundamental principle that law enforcement officers cannot use their badges as weapons to settle personal scores. Professor Miller was arrested in his classroom, a sacred space of learning, for no reason other than the fact that Officer Thorne disliked him. This lawsuit seeks not only just compensation for the profound violation of Professor Miller's civil rights, but also a court-mandated reform of a campus police system that is clearly broken. We are demanding a new era of accountability at Northwood." The story, which had already been a local sensation, exploded onto the national stage. Cable news networks picked it up. Editorials were written in major newspapers. The case of the classroom arrest became a symbol of unchecked police power in an unexpected setting. The $9.8 million figure was a shockwave that reverberated through the city. It was a number that taxpayers could understand. It translated the abstract concepts of civil rights and abuse of power into a tangible and terrifying financial liability. For the Northwood College District's Board of Trustees, the lawsuit was no longer a potential problem they had to manage. It was an existential threat that could bankrupt the district and leave an indelible stain on its legacy. The fight was no longer about one professor and 2 rogue cops. It was about the future of an entire institution. The official notification of the lawsuit arrived at the Northwood College District office via a certified courier. The thick manila envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds in Dr. Evelyn Reed's hands. She had known it was coming. but the reality of the document, over 100 pages of meticulously detailed allegations, legal precedents, and the staggering $9.8 million demand, was a gut punch. She immediately convened an emergency closed session of the Board of Trustees. The 7 members, prominent citizens from the worlds of business, law, and community activism, gathered in the district boardroom, the same room where the crisis team had first met. This time, the mood was infinitely more grim. Copies of the lawsuit were placed at each seat, and the silence in the room was deafening as they read through the initial summary prepared by William Sterling. "As you can see," Sterling began, his voice grave, "this is not an opportunistic or frivolous lawsuit. It is expertly crafted by one of the best civil rights attorneys in the state. Every allegation is backed by evidence we already know to be true. The student videos, the officer's own body cameras, the testimony of Dean Albright, and the history of complaints against Officer Thorne." One of the board members, a retired judge named Marcus Thorne, no relation, looked up from the document, his brow furrowed. "Their legal theory targets the district for deliberate indifference. They're arguing we knew, or should have known, that Thorne was a problem employee and that we failed to act, thereby creating the conditions for this to happen. What's our exposure on that front?" "Will." Sterling took a deep breath. "It's our greatest vulnerability. The complaints against Thorne were not formally disciplined, but they were documented. Their legal team will argue that this pattern of informal resolutions constitutes a de facto policy of tolerance for misconduct. They will depose every officer on the force. They will depose Chief Harrison. They will ask him, under oath, why a man with Thorne's record was still on patrol, and he will not have a satisfactory answer." Another board member, the CEO of a large tech company, shook her head. "And the demand? $9.8 million? Is that a realistic number? Our insurance will cover some of it, but our deductible is $2 million. A settlement or a verdict of that size would be catastrophic. We'd have to cut academic programs, lay off staff." "It's an opening figure." "Of course," Sterling said. "But it's not outlandish given the facts. The flagrancy of the constitutional violations, the setting in a classroom, the sheer malice involved. A jury could very well be sympathetic to a number in that range, especially the punitive damages. Ms. Vance is known for taking cases to trial and winning. She's not just looking for a check. The lawsuit explicitly calls for injunctive relief. That means court-ordered, systemic reforms." The room fell silent again as the board members contemplated the precipice they were on. For years, they had overseen budgets, approved new buildings, and set broad educational policies. They had left the day-to-day management of departments like campus security to the administrators. Now, that lack of oversight had come back to haunt them in the most spectacular fashion. Dr. Reed, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. Her voice was firm, cutting through the anxiety in the room. "We have 2 crises here. The first is the legal and financial one, which we must manage to protect the viability of this district. The second, and in my opinion the more important one, is a crisis of integrity. What happened to Professor Miller was a moral failure on our part. We employed a man who used his badge as a weapon, and we looked the other way when we saw the warning signs. We cannot defend the indefensible." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. "Therefore, our legal strategy cannot be one of denial or obfuscation. It must be one of accountability. We need to instruct our legal team to move toward a settlement. But more importantly, we need to begin the process of reform now. We cannot wait for a court to order us to do it. We need to fire the officers involved. We need to bring in an outside agency to conduct a top-to-bottom review of our campus police department. We need to prove through actions, not just words, that we understand the gravity of our failure and are committed to fixing it." Her words shifted the energy in the room. The initial shock and fear began to be replaced by a grim sense of purpose. The board members nodded in agreement. The legal battle would be costly, and the financial hit would be painful. But the cost of losing the public's trust, the trust of their faculty and students, was a price they could not afford to pay. The crisis that had begun in room 204 had now fully arrived in the boardroom, forcing the highest levels of leadership to confront the rot that had been allowed to grow in their own backyard. The morning after the lawsuit was filed, the district officially moved to place officers Mark Thorne and Chris Jenkins on unpaid administrative leave. It was a procedural step, but a significant one. The flow of their paychecks stopped. Their badges and credentials were formally confiscated, and they were barred from setting foot on any district property. The message was clear. They were no longer considered trusted members of the institution. For Chris Jenkins, the news was received with a sense of resigned dread. He had spent the last week in a state of anxious limbo, replaying the events in his mind, his guilt and regret a constant, sickening weight. He spoke only to his wife and the internal affairs investigators. He knew his career was over. The unpaid suspension was just the first formal step on a path to inevitable termination. He accepted his fate with a quiet, broken shame. For Mark Thorne, the news was received with explosive rage. He sat in his living room, the same house that shared a property line with David Miller, and read the official email from HR on his phone. It was clinical, impersonal. He threw the phone across the room, where it shattered against the wall. "Unpaid? They can't do that," he yelled to his wife, who flinched from the other room. "I have union protection. They can't just cut me off before the investigation is even finished." But he was wrong. The severity of the incident, combined with the mountain of irrefutable video evidence, gave the district more than enough cause to take the aggressive step. His union representative had called him, his voice flat, advising him that fighting the unpaid suspension would be a losing battle. The union would provide him with legal counsel for the internal and criminal investigations, but their enthusiasm was noticeably absent. Thorne was what they called a toxic case, one so indefensible that even the most aggressive union tactics were likely to fail and generate bad press. Later that day, the story hit the media with renewed force. Northwood officers suspended without pay amid $9.8 million lawsuit. Local television news crews were dispatched to Thorne's neighborhood. A reporter stood on the public sidewalk, with Thorne's house visible in the background, recounting the details of the lawsuit and the infamous fence dispute. Another camera crew was at the college, interviewing students who overwhelmingly supported the district's decision and called for the officer's permanent removal. The public shaming was relentless. Thorne, a man who had derived his entire sense of self-worth from the authority of his uniform, was now trapped in his own home. A pariah in the community he had once patrolled. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away. Friends from the force stopped returning his calls. He was isolated, toxic. The power he had wielded so carelessly was gone, and in its absence, he was left with nothing but his own boiling resentment. His anger, unable to be directed at Miller, now turned toward his former partner. He left a series of rambling, furious voicemails on Jenkins's phone. "You sold me out, you coward! You were supposed to be my partner, have my back. You just rolled over for them." The messages were a clear attempt at intimidation, but they were also the desperate cries of a man who couldn't accept his own culpability. Jenkins saved the voicemails and forwarded them to his lawyer, adding witness tampering to Thorne's growing list of transgressions. The national attention intensified. Civil rights organizations issued statements praising Professor Miller's courage and using his case as a rallying cry for police reform on college campuses across the country. Law enforcement watchdog groups dissected the student videos online, using them as training material for what not to do. The names Mark Thorne and Chris Jenkins became synonymous with police misconduct, suspended in disgrace, their careers in tatters and their futures uncertain. The two men who had walked into room 204 with such confidence were now consumed by the fallout. Jenkins grappled with his guilt, cooperating fully with the investigation in a desperate hope for some measure of leniency, perhaps avoiding criminal charges. Thorne, on the other hand, doubled down on his victimhood narrative, blind to his own role in his downfall. He saw conspiracies and betrayals everywhere, unable to grasp the simple truth that his own actions, driven by a petty grudge and an inflated ego, had led him to this point. The suspension was not the end of his fall from grace, but merely the beginning of a long, public, and agonizing descent. With the lawsuit filed and the officers suspended, the district's legal team, led by William Sterling, moved into damage control mode. The Board of Trustees had given them a clear, if painful, directive. Resolve this quickly and show a commitment to substantive change. Sterling reached out to Eleanor Vance, Professor Miller's attorney, to open settlement negotiations. The initial meeting took place in a neutral downtown law office. The atmosphere was professional, but tense. Sterling and the district's outside counsel sat on one side of a massive conference table. Vance and a junior associate sat on the other. Sterling began, "Eleanor, my client, the district, is here in good faith. We are not going to contest the core facts of what happened to Professor Miller. It was wrong, and we have already taken steps to address it by suspending the officers and launching an external review of our police department. We would like to discuss a financial settlement that is fair to your client and allows the district to move forward." He slid a folder across the table. It contained an initial settlement offer, $1.5 million. It was a substantial amount, designed to show they were serious. Eleanor Vance opened the folder, glanced at the number for a fraction of a second, and pushed it back across the table. "William, I appreciate the gesture," she said, her voice even. "But you and I both know this isn't just about money. If my client wanted a quick payday, we would have accepted this and moved on. This is about ensuring that what happened to David Miller never, ever happens to anyone else in your district," she continued, her tone hardening. "My client will not agree to any settlement that does not include a comprehensive, court-enforceable consent decree mandating specific, non-negotiable reforms to your campus police force. The financial component is secondary to the institutional change we are demanding." She then laid out their terms, and they were sweeping. First, the immediate termination of Thorne and Jenkins and a formal request by the district to the state's Peace Officer Standards and Training Post Board to permanently revoke their law enforcement certifications, ensuring they could never work as cops anywhere in the state again. Second, the establishment of an independent civilian-led oversight committee with the power to investigate complaints, review use of force incidents, and recommend disciplinary action completely independent of the police chief's office. Third, a complete rewrite of the department's use of force policy to emphasize de-escalation, and mandatory annual training on implicit bias, cultural competency, and constitutional rights, to be conducted by an outside organization approved by Vance's firm. Fourth, a mandate that all interactions between campus police and individuals be recorded by body cameras, with strict penalties for officers who fail to activate their cameras, and a policy that makes the footage easily accessible to the public and the Oversight Committee. Finally, she addressed the money. "As for the financial compensation, your offer is not in the ballpark. We will not entertain any discussion below 8 figures. Given the malicious intent, the federal civil rights violations, and the permanent emotional and professional damage, we believe a jury will have no problem reaching that number. We are prepared to go to trial. Are you? The district's lawyers were taken aback by the scope and intransigence of the demands. A court-enforced consent decree would mean years of federal oversight and millions in compliance costs. On top of any settlement, it was a high price for accountability. They spent the next few weeks in a tense back and forth. The district's insurance company balked at the high number and the reform demands, urging them to fight it in court. But Sterling and Dr. Reed held firm. They presented the board with a cost-benefit analysis that was brutal in its clarity. A protracted legal battle would mean years of negative headlines. It would mean depositions where every systemic failure of the district would be laid bare in the public record. It would mean a jury trial where the damning student videos would be played on a giant screen. And if they lost, they could be on the hook for the full $9.8 million plus Vance's astronomical legal fees. And a judge would likely impose reforms even more stringent than the ones being offered. The high price of a settlement, they argued, was still cheaper than the catastrophic cost of losing at trial. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The board had to choose between a painful, expensive settlement that allowed them to control the narrative of reform, or a potentially fatal gamble in a federal courtroom. The era of quietly handling problems was over. Eleanor Vance had ensured that accountability would be public, painful, and, above all, expensive. The district was learning, in the harshest way possible, the true cost of looking the other way. While the lawyers negotiated the multi-million-dollar settlement, the internal administrative process moved toward its inevitable conclusion. The external investigation, led by Elena Ramirez, delivered its final report to Dr. Reed and the Board of Trustees. It was a scathing indictment. The report concluded that Officer Mark Thorne had acted with clear malice and retaliatory intent. Using his official capacity to settle a personal grievance, it found he had falsified his initial report and lied to investigators. The recommendation was unequivocal: immediate termination for gross misconduct. The report was nearly as harsh on Officer Chris Jenkins. While acknowledging his cooperation, it concluded that his failure to intervene in the face of a clear and obvious abuse of power constituted a grave dereliction of duty. It cited his role in enabling an unlawful arrest and his failure to protect the civil rights of a citizen. The recommendation was the same: termination. Armed with this ironclad report, the district scheduled the final termination hearings. They were a formality. Thorne arrived with his union lawyer, still defiant, still clinging to the fiction that he was the victim. He repeated his discredited story. But the evidence against him was an avalanche. The board voted unanimously. Mark Thorne's employment with the Northwood Community College District was terminated, effective immediately. Jenkins's hearing was a more somber affair. He offered no defense. He simply apologized for his actions, his voice thick with shame. "I know what I did was wrong," he said quietly to the board. "I failed Professor Miller. I failed the community, and I failed to live up to the oath I took. I accept full responsibility." The board's vote was the same. His career in law enforcement was over, but the district's actions didn't stop there. As part of the ongoing settlement negotiations with Eleanor Vance, the district's legal team drafted a formal letter to the state's post board. The letter detailed the findings of the investigation and formally requested that the law enforcement certifications for both Thorne and Jenkins be permanently revoked. This was the final, career-ending blow. Without post-certification, a person cannot be employed as a police officer anywhere in the state. The post board opened its own investigation, but with the district's exhaustive report and the video evidence, the outcome was preordained. Several months later, after their own hearings, the board issued its ruling. Mark Thorne's certification was permanently revoked, with the board's decision noting his actions demonstrated a shocking lack of integrity and a profound unfitness for duty. Chris Jenkins's certification was also revoked, though the board allowed for the possibility of reapplication after 5 years. A small nod to his cooperation, though it was unlikely any department would ever hire him again. The news of their firings and decertification was a quiet, administrative end to a very public scandal. For Mark Thorne, the finality was devastating. The identity he had built for himself, the power he had craved and abused, was gone forever. He faced potential criminal charges for official oppression and a mountain of legal bills from the civil suit. No reputable security firm would hire him. He was unemployable in the only field he knew, his name now a permanent stain in the state's law enforcement records. For Chris Jenkins, the end of his career was a painful but necessary consequence. He left the state with his family, seeking anonymity and a chance to start over in a different line of work. The shame of his inaction would follow him, a personal sentence far longer than any the board could impose. The supervisors in the campus police department who had repeatedly ignored the informal complaints against Thorne were also held accountable. Chief Harrison was forced into an early retirement, his legacy forever tarnished by the scandal that happened on his watch. Another lieutenant was demoted. The message sent throughout the district was clear and cold. The era of sweeping problems under the rug was over. The chain of command was just as responsible as the officers on the ground. The careers that ended were not just those of the 2 men who walked into room 204, but also of the leaders who had failed to stop them long before they ever crossed that threshold, after months of intense, often contentious negotiations. The day of resolution finally arrived. In a press conference held jointly by the Northwood College District and Eleanor Vance's law firm, the terms of the landmark settlement were announced. The district, accepting full responsibility, agreed to pay David Miller and his family $9.8 million. It was the exact amount originally demanded, a stunning legal victory that signaled a complete capitulation by the district and its insurers. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood at the podium, her expression somber but resolute. Today, the Northwood District takes a significant step toward rectifying a profound wrong, she stated, her voice steady. The financial settlement reflects the severe harm done to Professor Miller, a respected and valued member of our academic community. But this is about more than money. It is about rebuilding trust. It is about ensuring our campus is a place of safety and respect for all. Then, Eleanor Vance stepped forward to detail the second, and arguably more important, part of the victory. She announced the creation of a legally binding consent decree, which would be overseen by a federal judge for the next 5 years. The terms were sweeping and represented a complete overhaul of campus policing. The decree included every reform she had demanded: the creation of the Civilian Oversight Board with real power, the complete revision of use of force policies, and mandatory, ongoing training in de-escalation and constitutional rights. The body camera policy was now one of the strictest in the nation, with footage of any complaint-generating incident to be released to the Oversight Board within 48 hours. This settlement is a victory not just for Professor Miller, but for every student and educator in this district, Vance declared, her voice ringing with passion. It sends a clear message to institutions everywhere. Accountability is not optional. You cannot allow officers who abuse their power to remain on the force. You cannot ignore patterns of misconduct. If you do, the price you pay will be steep, not just in dollars, but in court-ordered, fundamental change. The news of the settlement was a national story. It was hailed as a model for how institutions should respond to police misconduct, with swift accountability, transparency, and a commitment to deep, systemic reform rather than just cosmetic changes. Legal scholars and civil rights advocates pointed to the Northwood Decree as a new gold standard for campus safety. For David Miller, who stood quietly beside his wife, Clara, just off to the side of the podiums, the moment was surreal. The money was a life-altering sum, but it felt secondary. The real victory was in the reforms. His personal humiliation had been transformed into a powerful catalyst for change that would protect countless others in the future. He had taught history his entire life, and now he had made it. His case would be studied in law schools and public policy programs for years to come. Later that evening, after the press had gone and the lawyers had departed, David sat in his backyard. The new fence stood tall and straight along the correct property line, a silent monument to the bizarre ordeal. The neighbor's house, where Mark Thorne had once lived, was dark. A for sale sign had been pounded into the lawn a week earlier. He thought about his students. They had been the first witnesses, the first documentarians of the injustice. Their courage in recording and sharing what they saw had been the first crucial step on this long road. He made a mental note to dedicate the first lecture of the next semester to the role of citizen journalism in modern civil rights movements. The victory was not without its costs. The emotional toll on him and his family had been immense, but as the sun set, casting a warm glow over his quiet yard, he felt a sense of peace. Justice, like progress, was not always guaranteed. It had to be fought for. It had to be defended. And today, in a victory that would echo far beyond the walls of his classroom, justice had been won. Weeks later, the fall semester began at Northwood Community College. David Miller walked into room 204, the same room where his life had been upended. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, just as it had before. The students filling the seats looked at him with a new kind of respect, a quiet awe. They knew who he was, not just as a history professor, but as the man who had faced down the system and won. He walked to the podium, placing his leather briefcase on its surface. He looked out at their faces and felt a surge of gratitude. He was back where he belonged. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice calm and steady. "For those who don't know me, my name is Professor David Miller, and today, we're going to begin our study of American history. History is not just a story of dates and famous names. It is the story of power, how it is acquired, how it is used, and, most importantly, how it is held accountable." A ripple of understanding went through the room. The lesson had already begun. The changes his case had brought were visible everywhere. The campus police officers had new uniforms and new patrol cars, cosmetic changes that belied the deep shifts happening within the department. The new interim chief, a woman brought in from outside with a reputation as a reformer, held open forums with students and faculty. The newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee, which included a faculty seat that David Miller had been asked to fill, held its first public meeting. A training bulletin circulated through every department on campus. It didn't show a picture. It didn't name names. It simply contained a quote from the final settlement agreement. "The authority granted to our employees is a sacred public trust. When that trust is broken, the consequences for the institution will be severe, and the accountability for the individual will be absolute." It was the district's new mantra. David's life, too, had a new beginning. The settlement had given him and Clara financial security beyond their wildest dreams. But more than that, the ordeal had given him a new purpose. He became an advocate, speaking at conferences about civil rights and institutional accountability. He used his story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a case study in how ordinary citizens, armed with evidence and resolve, could force profound change. He and Clara established a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in public interest law, ensuring the next generation of Eleanor Vances would have the support they needed. The scars of the event remained. There were moments when a sudden, loud noise would make him flinch. He felt a pang of anxiety whenever he saw a police uniform, but these scars were not marks of defeat. They were reminders of the fragility of rights, the corrupting nature of unchecked power, and the quiet strength it takes to stand firm in the face of injustice. He had been tested not in a battle of swords or shields, but in a battle of wills and principles, and he had endured as we reflect on this story. It's crucial to look beyond the headlines and into the human psychology that drove this crisis. Mark Thorne's actions didn't spring from a vacuum. They were born from a deep-seated insecurity, a corrosive envy for the quiet respect Professor Miller commanded, a respect Thorne felt he could only obtain through intimidation. The fence was merely the trigger. The real conflict was a clash between two types of authority: Miller's, earned through knowledge and integrity, and Thorne's, granted by a badge and a gun. When his perceived authority was challenged in a petty civil matter, his fragile ego couldn't withstand it, and he weaponized his profession to reassert a dominance he felt was slipping away. What if Professor Miller had reacted differently? Had he shouted back, argued, or even physically resisted the unlawful arrest? Thorne would have felt vindicated. The narrative would have shifted. A headline of "Professor Assaults Officer Smearing the Truth." His calm, principled compliance was his most powerful weapon, as it denied his aggressor any justification and laid the abuse bare for all to see. It teaches us a difficult lesson. In the face of tyranny, sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is a refusal to descend to its level. We must protect ourselves not just by fighting back, but by creating an unimpeachable record of our own righteousness. This story is a powerful testament to the idea that systems are not self-correcting. They are corrected by pressure, by evidence, and by courage. The students with their phones, Dean Albright in the hallway, Eleanor Vance in the courtroom, they were the fail-safes that the institution itself lacked. True justice is rarely handed down from on high. It is fought for, inch by painful inch, from the ground up. This journey leaves us with questions to ponder in our own communities. Have you ever seen a small injustice and stayed silent, fearing the consequences of speaking up? What does real accountability look like in the institutions that govern your life? From your workplace to your local government? Share this story with someone who needs to see what happens when ordinary people refuse to look away. Your voice, your perspective, and your demand for integrity are what bend the arc of history toward justice.